Dave, I want to jump forward. In the last segment, you talked a lot about TBM and the role of understanding the costs with do you add capacity, do you add digital platforms, what are the dependencies, how to make the best informed decision. One of the pieces to this discussion has got to be around, and you mentioned this early on, shared services as well as working capital funds. I'm not sure if the SEC has a working capital fund per se, but walk me through how you're managing IT as a business through these, if you will, shared efforts to better capture the true cost of IT.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do not have a working capital fund in the SEC, so the dollars that we are managing are appropriated dollars. So I think that's I would start there. As we deal then with shared services, and this is always an important conversation to have with the leadership across the agency is, a shared service to me is a decision about, well, what are you going to centralize and what are you not going to centralize. So it's the trade between being efficient and being effective, because often that's the trade that you're making. So networks is kind of the quintessential example of that. That is a shared service. It's designed to be a shared service. Certainly right now. Regardless, you need connectivity to your cloud provider. You need connectivity to your on-prem data centers. So that's a shared service, and it's also a unique skill set. So hard to replicate in the business units. As you creep up the stack, then we make decisions in other shared services. Touch on security and compliance. That's certainly a shared service because it's a skill set and it's something that doesn't make sense necessarily to replicate in the business. So how we track the costs of that is really well how much do we need of that skill set, and then what's our capacity that we want to have on let's say on an annual basis, and that those shared services become I'll say a throttle, but they're certainly a consideration for the things that we want to do, either modernization efforts or maintenance efforts or bringing things on new. Those do become constraints, if you will, that we have to understand. So it is certainly, I think, understanding the cost is important, but from my perspective, also understanding what the capacity is of the shared service is also just as important. And if we need to add capacity, that's certainly a cost. But where we're at right now, at least where I'm at, is really trying to understand what we can do to improve the capacity of our shared services without adding cost necessarily.
A lot of the shared services I think you're talking about is a lot of internal shared services. Are you looking external as well, whether for financial or HR? I know payroll, obviously, for the entire government is an external shared service. There's also the stuff from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Yeah. CISA has some shared services that they're starting to put out there for security stuff. Does that also play into the discussion about total cost, sharing of costs, and who's paying for it?
Yeah, it absolutely does, right? So, I mean, certainly at the macro level, you're absolutely right. The agency does not have its own timekeeping system. We leverage another agency's shared service to do that. A lot of our financial services are provided, by another agency. So those you're absolutely right. Those decisions of does it make sense for the agency to maintain its own capability or leverage another department that has that capability and shares it out is absolutely a consideration. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we're gonna particularly with the QSMOs that OMB put into place, that trend I think is certainly going to accelerate. And you're right, I think, to touch on CISA's role now as a shared service provider. And that just touches on the point we were on earlier about skill sets, and we want to make sure that we're building capacity in one area, and if we are, then sharing that out, because skills sometimes are hard, particularly specialized skills are hard to come by.
Maybe it's too early, so if it is, obviously let us know. But does the use of TBM, does the use of understanding what the business costs are, what's driving the business costs, does that play into a decision around shared services? Security is probably the best example, because you could go do a vulnerability disclosure platform on your own, but I could also buy it from CISA. And how do you kind of make that decision based on the business costs, based on other capacity costs and other considerations?
It's a great question. I think we're always going to look to not develop, right? That's not necessarily the first choice, right? We're always going to look to adopt somebody else's capability, particularly in the vulnerability platform area. I mean, we're certainly users of the CDM dashboard. So there are a lot of those capabilities that we want to adopt or leverage as the first choice. The second choice then is to buy, right? That's adopt a managed service, if you will, rather than to develop it on our own. However, if there's a mission specific need where we do need to develop something, that's also an option that we'll go do, and we do. But we want to look at those two other choices first.
Dave, we've talked a lot about how you're dealing with budgeting and forecasting, how you're using data to drive those decisions. We're about a year into the pandemic. That threw a big old curveball into everybody's budgeting and forecasting, I'm sure. Walk me through how that pandemic really impacted your plans, the SEC's plans to really get IT improved, changed, to add to it. What did you have to do differently over the last year?
That's a really good question. I guess I'd start where the SEC is actually a pretty remote workforce already, even prior to the pandemic. If you think about a lot of the agency's work, either in examinations or enforcement, it's with the folks that we're examining. It's with in courtrooms. It's outside of the office. So luckily, luckily is a good term, but we had the infrastructure in place to actually enable remote work. It certainly got more of a workout. It's as we've gone throughout the year, but we've had the culture in place where people in the tools that folks could use. So it was mostly, in that regard, it was actually just using it more, and certainly making adjustments in terms of how we culturally interact, do knowledge management, bring people on board. So that's been the adjustments, I think, over this past year, adapting the technology that we have. We're on Zoom right now, so how does that work when you're onboarding? I have going to interview a potential new hire in a little bit. We'll be on video conferencing as well. So adapting, I think, has been the challenge over the course year, and making sure that people understand the technology and the tools that are available to them, and are adapting. And I have to tell you, from an SEC perspective, people have been wonderful about doing that. That said, that it has changed our stance. We've shifted a little bit, I think, as everybody else has, in terms of, we had some cybersecurity things that we were looking to do that we've shifted now towards, let's make sure our remote connectivity is as secure as we could possibly make it. We had some plans to do recap of infrastructure in our offices, whether they're out throughout the rest of the country, or here in DC, that maybe it doesn't make sense to do that those types of upgrades right now. We want to actually make sure that we're investing those dollars in remote work capabilities, cybersecurity capabilities, knowing that folks are going to be continuing to work remote for certainly for a while longer yet. And then probably we'll be in the hybrid world where folks are going to be working sometimes in the office, sometimes from home, but always, in another location.
So it sounds to me like you've had to maybe do some realignment of resources to meet different mission goals, as you said, remote working, cyber working. Where did the TBM, the data, kind of play into those decisions, or maybe it didn't because they were pretty straightforward decisions?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think what we had to do was pretty clear. Going back to the point of and where the value of TBM is, what are the investments that we need to make it in areas all up and down the stack in order to make that happen, right? So, for our purposes, just interestingly enough, right, going back to the network example, we found early on, as a lot of agencies did, we actually didn't have enough phone lines coming into our data centers, right? So, people, because our phone design was, well, most people were calling out, they weren't calling in. To our on-prem capabilities, particularly as we got going with video conferencing, we had to change that. So we actually had to enable an awful lot of phone capacity to deal with that change in usage pattern. There were investments we needed to make in other areas actually to make that happen. We talked about labor. We talked about security and compliance. We talked about in the TBM cost pools where we have servers and storage. Understanding all of that and the investments and changes that you need to make in all of those areas to provide that mission capability, I think is certainly the value of TBM, and then being able to communicate that back to the CXOs.
Dave, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. My guest today is Dave Bottom, the Chief Information Officer at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm Jason Miller, and you're listening to Ask the CIO, sponsored by Aptio on Federal News Network.